Hide to Survive, if you didn't know, is a series of FNAF fan games made on the Scratch website. Its creator, Chuck Parker 1126, recently quit the site as of the release of Hide to Survive's big final game, Hide to Survive 3. Despite how long his account has existed for, not even being 3 years old, these Hide to Survive games are genuinely some of the best games on the site, with each new release really highlighting the improvement of the developer behind them. Now that Chuck Parker is done with this series of games for good, I like to look back at these games all the way from the beginning and really take a comprehensive look at them from the very start to the very end. And yes, that does mean I'll be going over the first Hide to Survive and cover a lot of the same points as I did in that video. Although, I won't nearly spend as much time analyzing the game as I already have. Feel free to skip ahead using video chapters below if you aren't interested in me going over that game again. With that out of the way, let's begin. Hide to Survive first began with the release of the original game to the public all the way back on August 9th, 2020. It should be noted that this wasn't Chuck's first game, being just one game in an already existing roster of FNAF fan games like One Night at Teddy's and Welcome to the Future. This game was different though. Different from the others he made in that this game is actually functional. Going into it, you can see from the start that, as the first game in series tends to be, especially on Scratch, this game definitely has its issues. The warning/intro screen is way too long, the skip feature for it is broken, and the model of the main character Rabby could be significantly improved. And the game itself has a very easy and simple gameplay loop that really does not work in its favor. Despite all this, it was definitely Chuck's best game at the time. It was also the game that boosted Chuck to the level of popularity he has today. And all jokes aside, the game is at least still average in my opinion, especially for the Scratch website. Once you press play in the menu, you get directed to the only real exposition this game gives. A newspaper. Classic. Which details how the Rabby animatronic was moved over to some kind of storage facility after it went on an apparent murderous rampage. And you, my friend, the player, have to look over him for a single night until he is presumably destroyed by a furnace. That's simple enough, eh? And hey, looks like what the newspaper said lines up with the contents of the game. You start in an office room in a fairly small building where, if you look on cam 1, well, would you look at that, it's Rabby. And, like literally any FNAF game ever made, will start chasing you around. To defend yourself, you're equipped with lights that make the hallways viewable and are crucial for locating Rabby, as well as 2 shock buttons above each corresponding door, which, if Rabby is there, will shock and reset him back to camera 1. It's a very simple gameplay loop, kinda like a worse FNAF 1. Of course, without any secondary features, this gameplay loop would be really bad. So that's why on cam 2, there's an oxygen bar which needs to be refilled remotely on a consistent basis. All of this makes for the complete gameplay dynamic of the original Hide to Survive. You really just check on both doors with the lights, shock Rabby if he's there, and occasionally move to cam 2 to wind up the oxygen. Needless to say, that's about it for the gameplay. It's very basic, not really something I'd want to play more than once. Luckily, this game only has 1 night worth of content, so that's never really an issue. If you want to look at the art aspect of things, as I said before, there's a lot that can be improved. In my opinion, the office is pretty much the only remotely decent looking thing, with everything like the cameras and Rabby himself being very basic and lacking real detail. And my point is, it really isn't much to look at. Not exactly a hot take, I know, but, you know, I might as well bring it up. Finally, once you cycle through Rabby appearing at your door a few times and, you know, beat the night, you'll get to the game's ending cutscene, which features the night guard sleeping in his bed after a long day of doing the same things over and over again for a couple minutes. Then, of course, as these games tend to go, Rabby appears from underneath the bed, and the cutscene ends. So what is there to really say about this game? Well, as a standalone title, I have to admit it's really not the greatest thing. It's functional at least, which is nice, but there's really not much that can be said for the game. It's not like I can even go much more in depth on, say, the gameplay or art or anything else, because the game lacks content to a point where I can summarize the entire gameplay experience without leaving out very much in just a couple of paragraphs. What I've said so far about this game really is all there is to say. To summarize, it is bare bones, alright? Looking at it from the perspective of the whole Hide to Survive series though, it's clear that this is the start of something good. This original game, in my opinion, provides a really good framework with a lot of potential for any future sequels and remakes, which the creator definitely tried to take advantage of in his next release, Hide to Survive 2. Hide to Survive 2, the original version, was a game that released, well, I don't actually know. The game was taken down at some point from scratch, which has made finding the original version of the game a lot more difficult. I'm also not about to play a remix for this review because, simply put, I don't know what they could have changed in all those remixes and projects and whatever. So, you know. Luckily, Biscuit Dog came in clutch here on this random video we posted providing both the project ID and the release date, so I was able to play the game without issue. From the very start, you can see this game is an improvement compared to its original counterpart. For one, the warning screen isn't nearly as long, and the parallax to the menu looks decent. There's no title on the title screen for whatever reason though, probably a bug. There's also some original music playing here on the menu, though it does sound mildly atrocious. With that out of the way, of course, we see Rabby, who looks to be presumably older than the original Rabby. Either that or he's covered in black spots for just no reason at all, must have got the Black Death or something. Whatever it is though, the model does look better than the original Rabby. It just looks a bit uncanny. And not in a good way either, it's a bit odd. Unlike the first game, Hide to Survive 2 features 3 entire nights, which is a pretty clear sign of technical improvements between this and the first game, considering it only had one night. Now, going into the actual game, you'll notice there isn't any real exposition that's given at the start or through any phone calls, which is definitely a bit of a letdown. Instead, you'll notice this game's structuring. In essence, it's divided into 2 distinct gameplay phases. Phase 1 being a short sequence between the player and Rabby where the player has to do various tasks as a form of testing on the animatronic. Despite these specific tasks changing each night, the overall gameplay of those remains the exact same. I don't particularly like this phase of gameplay if I'm being honest, but whatever, it doesn't really harm the game either way if it's in it. Phase 2 of the gameplay, on the other hand, is where the actual office segment of the game begins. You'll notice you aren't playing this game until 6 AM, 8 AM, or any other time actually. Rather, in a similar manner to FNAF 6, you'll be loading in various tasks on the monitor to your right. When all tasks are completed, you can end the night. It's not that simple though, because as you'd expect, Rabby's in the building chasing you down. You'll see him moving around your catalog of 6 cameras until he either hits your door, in which case you close it until he leaves, or he goes to the vent on camera 5, in which case you shock him on the camera. Besides this, you also have to keep track of the power, which goes down fairly quickly, so you can't exactly just shut the door forever. Now, this seems like a fairly promising gameplay loop on the surface, and hey, you might even be inclined to look back at this old game and say that it was pretty good. Having the change between doing a task, then moving quickly to shock or shut the door on Rabby seems promising, and like it might lead to some genuinely tense moments. Of course, if that was the case, this game probably wouldn't have been remade. Oh, what actually happens is you end up doing the first 3 tasks, closing the door on Rabby or shocking him in the vent, then you do the other 3 tasks and win the game in like under a minute. It's too easy. Night 3 is where things sort of get changed up. For one, the first phase of the gameplay is completely broken, and lets you skip it instantly. After that, you'll notice that Rabby is significantly more active on Night 3's office segment. You'll actually have to alternate between the task monitor and cams to really check where Rabby is. That is, of course, unless you get lucky and Rabby goes to the door once or more. Since the door can remain closed while you're on the task monitor, if Rabby by chance goes to the door multiple times over, you can, in essence, do every single task in the night in a row without doing anything else. This happened to me pretty much, and I was able to beat Night 3 in like 3 minutes. Power was really not that big of a factor either. Players who completed Night 3 of this game will eventually realize there's no ending cutscene. For whatever reason, you just get dragged back to the title screen. This is because of, presumably, a glitch that I guess just doesn't play the ending cutscene, so you'll literally have to go inside the game's code to play it. Luckily, the ending isn't even that big of a deal, gives virtually no exposition, and probably does more harm than good, considering listening to the music will make your ears bleed. No offense, Chuck. While there's much to complain about this game now, you should realize that at the time this was a major step up from the first game. The art is significantly better in this game, with the cameras being more detailed and Rabby himself looking vaguely better. The gameplay loop is definitely not the greatest thing ever, playing out like a worse FNAF 6. The main issue I see present in this game is that in its replication of FNAF 6, it forgets the most crucial part of it, having multiple animatronics. See, if FNAF 6 had only Molten Freddy in the game, it'd be pretty easy regardless of how high you spike the difficulty. That's pretty much what this game ends up playing out as. You really can't soak in any of the atmosphere or experience in general because each night can easily be completed in like 2, maybe 3 minutes if you've ever touched a FNAF game. Still though, it's a step up from the first game, and built up a lot of hype for what was this ongoing franchise. Many people seem to enjoy it, and hey, even if it's not my thing necessarily, at least the game is actually still playable. At this point though, many fans began to wonder, what would happen next for this series of games? At this point, the Hide to Survive games entered a bit of a weird phase. Plans to make a third Hide to Survive initially eventually crumbled and turned into various ideas of spin-offs. Plans were even made eventually for a ground-up reboot of the entire series, placing Rabby at a sort of amusement park where you'd apparently end up playing a ton of carnival-themed minigames alongside the main office gameplay. A trailer was even released for this game, as you're seeing on the screen right now, and it really did generate a lot of hype, but it ended up going nowhere. And this is where Hide to Survive's future began to get a little uncertain. Chuck would often go quiet for long periods of time, and few updates would ever be released on projects. Of course, as everyone knows, this wouldn't last forever. On June 10th, 2021, Hide to Survive 2 2021 released. It was announced beforehand, basically an accident because of Chuck accidentally leaking the game via Scratchbug. Still though, this came out of nowhere for a lot of people. Just from the thumbnail, it is immediately clear the increase in quality between this game and any other project Chuck had ever made, most important of which being the original Hide to Survive 2, featuring a unique font as well as a really clean model of Rabby, which is obviously leagues better than what was present in the original game. Upon entering the game, it's clear to see the menu is about as polished as these things tend to get in FNAF Scratch. The buttons size up smoothly when hovered over, and yet again you see the new and improved Rabby model. Let's get into the actual game. Similar to its predecessor, Hide to Survive 2 2021's gameplay is divided into two main gameplay segments. The first being, of course, the Repair Rabby segments, and the second being the main office gameplay. The first segment is pretty much the same as it was in the original game, even requiring similar tasks, the main difference being, of course, the massively upgraded graphics. It should be also noted that there's technically more tasks like these now, considering the amount of nights has went up from 3 in the original to around 5 for the main gameplay now. Just about everything with these minigames look and feel cleaner. Not to mention, again, the new Rabby model right in the center of it all. Much like with the original game, though, I'm still not the biggest fan of this part of the game, especially when it comes to this remake, because it feels like such a missed opportunity to me. Every other part of this game has been developed and refined to every last detail, but it feels really lazy how it was handled here. Each minigame is virtually the same, basically involving doing a basic task repeatedly until you hear the ding noise. Even if technically what you're doing is different each night, I don't know. You're basically doing the same thing either way. Night 4's minigame is straight up just reused the Night 1 task with the flashlight, and Night 5 doesn't even have a minigame. Rabby literally just does a virus test for a second, then dings without any player input. It feels like Chuck did 3 minigames, ran out of ideas, then just gave up on this segment of the game. Definitely a bit of a disappointment. I would have loved to have seen something more interesting happen each night. You know, maybe some more unique ways of testing Rabby. At least they're fast though, I guess, so, you know, they don't take up too much of your time. Phase 2 of the gameplay is what's more pressing though, and is where the bulk of your time playing this game will be spent. Fortunately, it's also a lot more interesting than the Testing Rabby minigame. You'll notice pretty quickly the similarities between this game and its predecessor, as well as all the glaring differences. Most notable of the similarities being the fact that there's only one door Rabby can go through, as well as an additional vent he can climb through as well. On the end of differences though, well, the big one would have to be this: Whack-A-Rabby. Whack-A-Rabby is a whack-a-mole type of arcade game that you can play in the office to pass the time between hours. It functions about exactly as how you'd expect. Hit the mole, or, well, Rabby, and you get points for it. Of course, this would be a pretty useless addition to the game if that was just it. That's where the secondary function of this minigame comes in, besides just being a way to pass the time. Phone Guy on night 1 tells you that if you manage to reach the high score in the game, he'll cover for the rest of your shift, i.e., if you get past 50,000 on the minigame, you automatically skip the night. And in the game where the hours are 12 minutes long total, yeah, you'll want to do a lot of that. No doubt an intentional feature, I think this adds some nice nuance to the nights. See, you could just wait the full 12 minutes, but not only is that boring, but also the longer you wait, the more there is a chance that Rabby and his friends will be able to sneak up on you and kill you. Then, all your 12 minutes of progress suddenly goes right back to 0. Wait, did I just say Rabby and friends? Yeah, you didn't hear me wrong. Hide to Survive 2 was the first game to feature other characters other than, the basic Rabby character. Those being a more withered version of Rabby, appropriately dubbed Old Rabby, alongside a naked endoskeleton that's named, well, Endo. These characters aim to add a bit of variety to the nights, probably also to help avoid the insanely luck-based gameplay of the original Hide to Survive 2, and while they do end up doing a pretty decent job at that on a mechanical level, with Old Rabby taking up your attention with his servo winding up, and Endo forcing you to find him on one of the cameras whenever his alarm goes off, I don't know, they just don't really stand out very well. That includes Rabby, by the way. All of the characters feel super uninteresting in my opinion. They have these generally bland designs, combined with the fact that they'll take these stiff, unmoving poses in every camera and place you'll find them at. I don't know, it just feels very forgettable to me. Even when Rabby's at your door, all he really does is just kinda stand there. Even when you hide from him under the desk to go away, he does nothing. It'd be cool if maybe the lights would maybe flicker, or he'd kinda move around the screen as you were hiding before he leaves, kinda like what Toy Chica and Toy Bonnie do in FNAF 2. I think it adds a lot of extra atmosphere to the game, and it'd make Rabby a lot more interesting visually. And I should emphasize, this is just a criticism of the visuals. The mechanics work fine for the most part. They're very basic, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just on a visual level, each character in this game feels very forgettable, is what I'm trying to say here. Let's do a quick recap. So there's 2 gameplay segments. The first is Repair Rabby, second is Office gameplay. Play Whack-A-Rabby to skip the nights. If Rabby appears at your door, hide under the desk. If he's in the vent, shock him. Find Endo on the cameras, wind up Old Rabby's servos. I think that's everything. When all is said and done, the gameplay loop generally ends up being a back and forth between the Whack-A-Rabby and dealing with the main cast that builds up over time. Again, you could just sit the whole time and not play Whack-A-Rabby, but that's boring, and the longer you're alive for, the more of a chance you have to die. This gameplay loop is particularly enjoyable because the progression towards it is honestly amazing. The Whack-A-Rabby segment implements some genius game design into this game. See, on earlier nights, especially night 1 and 2, you can play the Whack-A-Rabby minigame without much incident. Except the Rabby is almost guaranteed to show up at your door at least once. Now, you might be inclined to think this is bad, but it's actually pretty smart. You see, very few people actually want to play through those first few nights in any fan game. I mean, raise your hand if you ever felt bored on night 1 or 2 of a game. So why force them to play it? And the thing is, since Rabby and his friends attack at least once per night anyway, the player is still learning the mechanics actively. This slowly builds up over time until about night 3 and 4, where sitting on the Whack-A-Rabby is no longer possible, and you're forced to actively defend against Rabby and Co. repeatedly, with only small slivers of time available between attacks to play the minigame. Playing the Whack-A-Rabby only to be torn from it by, say, the Endo, then distracted by Rabby and Old Rabby, makes for a tense gameplay experience that really forces you to be as quick as you can be, especially when another character could be creeping around at any point. It's super enjoyable, especially on later nights. After each night segment, you unlock a small cutscene of what appears to be two people involved in a secret organization texting each other. The name of this organization? Cypher. Throughout each night, you see these short but interesting cutscenes that slowly reveal that they have been the ones tampering with the animatronics and making them more active over time, apparently with some kind of vendetta against the Night Guard you play as in the game. Throughout each night, they make it known it's their goal to kill you, a goal they achieve by the end of Night 5, where Rabi forcefully jumpscares you no matter what you do, killing the Night Guard. And as that happens, it seems that Cypher has now set its sights on someone else. It's an interesting story, what can I say? When you've beaten Night 5, this game does have a fair amount of post-game content to offer, mostly looking at the extras. There's also a Night 6, which, honestly, it was definitely the peak of the game. Night 6 felt like a fully realized version of Hide to Survive 2's gameplay. Having to juggle between the characters and the Whack-A-Rabbie was super enjoyable, and it was the right amount of difficulty, and was also surprisingly fun for being a Night 6 and a fan game. I'm not sure as to the canonicity of this night. I think it probably is canon. I mean, there's a phone call which pretty clearly sets us up as you being a new guard at the place after, the last one was killed, as the phone guy brings up the recently murdered guard separately from mentioning you or anything, so, I'm just saying, Chuck could have gone the custom night route and not added a phone call at all. So then, that was Hide to Survive 2 2021. This game was the first real taste anyone got of what Chuck could really do in the FNAF Scratch sphere, especially if you put his mind to it. The game's very polished in nearly every aspect, with everything feeling very smooth. The game definitely has its flaws, especially with certain parts of the game feeling very uninteresting, mainly the characters and the testing Rabi minigames, but in my opinion those flaws are really outweighed by how well this game plays out on its later nights. Not to mention, introducing new characters to this version of the game in comparison to the original game was definitely a good move, and makes things a lot more interesting than just dealing with a single animatronic. With this remake finally out though, it seemed that it was only a matter of time before Chuck ended up making and releasing his next big project. Hide to Survive 1 2021 was a game that was originally made for a tutorial series Chuck was working on, with the intention that the game could be used to bring a higher standard to the FNAF Scratch community through said tutorial. As time went on though, this tutorial slowly went out of relevance and was eventually discontinued entirely, but the game still remained in development. Releasing on August 9th, 2021, unlike Hide to Survive 2 2021, just about everyone anticipated the release of this game. What people took notice of almost immediately after release was Hide to Survive 1's broadly simplistic art style when put in comparison to the second game, marking a significant tonal shift between the two games as apparent almost as soon as the player sees the thumbnail and menu, which, as always, features Chuck's signature menu parallax. Unlike Hide to Survive 2, which at least made some attempt to be original, even if its mechanics were fairly basic, Hide to Survive 1 is about as much of a FNAF 1 clone as it gets. Featuring 2 doors, 2 lights, and a gradually lessening power supply, you'd think this would be a one-for-one remake of the original FNAF game, but surprise surprise, it actually works pretty well given the hand it's dealt. Now, I'm sure at least a few of you are wondering, if this really is a FNAF 1 clone, why would anyone want to play this? Well, to that I say 2 things. First off, give these games a chance. Not every game needs to be hyper original to be good. Basic games that follow the original FNAF formula can still be well made. And 2, I kinda lied when I said this game was a FNAF 1 clone. It's not exactly a one-for-one copy. There's at least 2 major elements that make this game stand out. The biggest difference being the faster draining, but rechargeable power, as well as Looney's backtracking mechanic when you stare at him on the camera. Speaking of Looney, let's talk about the characters. Hide to Survive 1 2021 was the first game that featured characters that weren't Rabi or a variant of him, or an Endo. Alongside Rabi, we've got Remus and Looney, who take a similar appearance to Rabi, just with altered colors and design elements. Both of these characters look awesome in my opinion, great addition to the game. These characters look visually appealing and really spice up the otherwise bland environment, presenting themselves much better than any of the characters in Hide to Survive 2 ever did. These characters follow relatively basic AI structures, with Rabi and Remus both going to either of your doors in your office, Meanwhile, Looney slowly moves through the building to attack you, only being stopped if the player stares at him on the cameras, which forces him to backtrack. Now, this might seem basic on its own, which, I mean, it is, but when combined with the previously mentioned power system, this game gets a little more interesting. You see, the power in this game goes down fast. If you aren't careful with the doors, you could drain up to like 15% of your power in a handful of seconds. No, that's not an exaggeration. That's why it's important to not only use the doors as sparingly as possible, but to also enter power save mode on the cameras whenever you can. Power save mode is Hide to Survive's method of recharging the power, allowing you to bring it back up as high as you want, as long as you're willing to sacrifice the ability to view the cameras. When combined, the gameplay loop is surprisingly fun for something that's a clear rip on the original FNAF. This game absolutely does not spare you its difficulty, as by night 3 the character is already capable of attacking you in under 20 seconds. The most tense part of the game by far is definitely the power. You'll have plenty of moments playing this game where, because the animatronics attack you at bad moments for you, your power permanently suffers for the rest of the night. You aren't able to recharge it back to 100 anymore in time before they appear again. And really, that's how the gameplay plays out. It's in essence a long game of delaying the inevitable. You will lose power over time, and the odds are, eventually, you won't be able to recharge it back to 100%. And that's the fun part. Can you delay the inevitable for just long enough to hit the 6 AM milestone? Or the power run out beforehand? Ultimately, it's up to how you play. Like I mentioned just now, this game will absolutely not spare you its difficulty. It's easily one of the more difficult fan games on the site, while still also being possible. By night 3, you really cannot afford to have your brain on autopilot when playing this game. And by night 4 and 5, the gameplay loop becomes insane. I hope you don't get too frustrated easily because this game will make you rage. Honestly, it's good though. With a game as basic as this, being even more basic than the original FNAF, you do kind of need to make it more difficult to be enjoyable, because nobody wants to play an easier FNAF. And hey, it wasn't like it was out of nowhere. Spiking the difficulty in a fan game is always tough, trust me, I know. But Hide to Survive 1 2021 does it about as smoothly as possible, while also making the nights feel distinct in their difficulty. And I do think the difficulty progression was pretty good given this context. Night 5 definitely feels like the real peak of the game, which makes sense because it's the final night of the game. That actually matters. Another thing I'd like to mention is the game's atmosphere. It works super well. From the menus to the actual game, the sound design is great. Throughout each night you hear this continued rain noise that plays and really sets up a good atmosphere. You're cold, alone, it's raining outside, and as the phone guy puts it,
we're kind of in the middle of nowhere.
Even as the game begins to tonally shift on later nights to the chaotic mayhem we all know and love the game for, the game still feels engaging in this regard, no doubt aided by the phone guy's calls each night where he slowly begins to explain the unfolding story to the player. And yeah, much like the original Hide to Survive 1, this game does have a story, although there is a lot more of it this time around. There is a night 6, and I did beat it, though it does feel a tad overkill in terms of how hard it is. Luckily, this isn't part of the main gameplay, so actually now that I think about it, I don't really care at all. Unlike Hide to Survive 2 though, Night 6 definitely was not the peak of the game. That would still have to go to Night 5 as mentioned previously. As always, there's also an extras menu and customite, but there's not really much to say on that matter besides it exists, I guess. What's more interesting, however, is the game's last important feature, the Endless Mode. Endless Mode in Hide to Survive is exactly what it sounds like. An endless version of the game with all characters enabled from the get-go that even features its own leaderboard. This is definitely one of the coolest things I've seen in a FNAF Scratch game, or even a FNAF game in general. Competing with everyone else who plays this game across the world for spots on the leaderboard for this otherwise simplistic game is just a neat thought, and it really plays out nicely here. I myself tried out Endless Mode a few times. My best run was about 8.5 minutes, which sadly was not enough to put me on the leaderboard, but hey, I still consider it pretty good. That's really all there is for Hide to Survive 1. It's the kind of FNAF fan game that's definitely a clone of the original FNAF, but despite how bad of a rep these types of games tend to usually get, it really rolls with a concept that makes for a fun and interesting experience despite its setup, all while being an expansion of an existing concept brought by the original Hide to Survive game. Genuinely, there's not much bad I can say about this game. The game really does not try to sell itself as anything more than what it is. Even the art is simplistic to reflect the game's rather basic functionality. Just about everything in this game works well. The story is good, the ending's nice, and the post-game content like Customite and Endless Mode is always cool to see. What's even more surprising was just how shortly after Hide to Survive 2 this game came out, showing Chuck's ability to work fast on these fan projects despite the amount of work, effort, and polish that goes into creating one of them. As always though, the age-old question began to really spring up by this point. With Hide to Survive 1 and 2 fully remade and better than ever, naturally, people only saw one way the series could progress. Just as people had expected when the series was still young, people now began to wait on a third Hide to Survive. This is where things began to get really uncertain for Hide to Survive. Over the next year of time, just about no news on Hide to Survive came out. Hide to Survive 3 was announced and teasers came and went, but nothing really came of it for the longest time. In fact, the developer, Chuck Parker 1126, started becoming increasingly inactive, often taking long several-month hiatuses which hindered the development of any projects. There was a real point in time where a lot of people thought that Hide to Survive might never get a proper conclusion, with just how long development of the third game was taking, and how rare it was to see Chuck online in the Scratch Sphere. On July 9th, 2022, Chuck announced that, despite all the hurdles in developing the game, Hide to Survive 3 would still be coming out. A few days later, it was revealed that the game was practically finished, being about 98% done. Soon after, we got a release date, July 22nd. Alongside that, we also got the official trailer for the game. Needless to say, nobody saw this coming. Chuck had done this all before, momentarily coming back to give some Hide to Survive 3 news, then disappearing for at least 2 months. This time was different though, because as we all know, Hide to Survive 3 really did end up releasing. On July 22nd, everyone was able to get their hands on this final part to the Hide to Survive franchise. The music sets the tone for the game as soon as you begin. The background is dark and hard to see, the music is ominous and foreboding, and Rabi's staring right towards the player with his red eyes. It's clear from the get-go this game really is the final act for Hide to Survive. What's also interesting is that this Rabi isn't actually the same one as what appears in-game. This one being a burnt version of Rabi, and this one looking more clean and normal. The atmosphere the game sets continues on into the actual game. We begin with a cutscene that seems to place this game chronologically right after Hide to Survive 1. Rabi is burning in an incinerator, but clearly, things haven't exactly gone to plan. Next, I want you to imagine this scenario. You're in a restaurant that features animatronic characters. It's a spacious building. There's lots of places you could potentially be working from. But out of all the rooms you could be doing the night shift in, you're right in the goddamn middle of it. There's absolutely no safety for you. There's an entrance in front of you, to your left, and to your right. There's even one behind you. There's not much noise either. It's just you and the quiet sound of ventilation. Until one of them appears. That's basically the immediate atmosphere this game gives off. If Hide to Survive 1 felt like you're in the middle of nowhere and isolated, Hide to Survive 3 feels like you're the loneliest man in the world. The environments on the camera are great, giving off this vibe that you really are all alone in the place. It doesn't help that the phone guy is quite literally the protagonist making voicemails for himself. That means the only voice you can hear is your own. Continuing on with the environments, this game definitely has the best use of parallax I've seen in a FNAF game. The cameras really look about as 3D as you can get in one of these games. Not to mention, the characters really pop out in them. Rabi, Remus, and Looney look great as always, especially the latter two. Aside from the cameras, you also have the office area, which is comparatively empty, but still looks nice. Plus, the device you use in the game also has a cool design. It vaguely reminds me of the handy unit from Sister Location. Here's another awkward transition, the device. This is the core asset of the gameplay. Just about every mechanic ties into this device at some point, so let's talk about it. The device is, well, a device that allows you to control the doors and reset certain characters. You can only have one door closed in this game at a time, and you can only close the doors if you enable Looney's aggression. You see, Looney in this game is interesting. He wanders around the building going into random rooms, but he never quite attacks you. In fact, he can't enter the office at all, unless you have the Looney aggression on. This basically ensures that you can't just close doors whenever you want. You can only do it if someone is at your door, and once they leave, you're basically forced to rush to turn off the aggression, otherwise, well, you know, you die. Speaking of people being at your door, that's where Remus and Rabby come in. Similar to Hide to Survive 1, they're the only two characters that actually appear in the doorways. You'll know they've entered your office once you see the screen flickering, and by that point, you just need to use the flashlight to see where they are. Just close the door where they're at, you've basically beat the game. The last remaining part of the device is the Tiny Rabby control. The Tiny Rabbies are 3 separate animatronics that appear on your desk from time to time, each of them having a unique design and being numbered. Simply press the button that corresponds to the Tiny Rabby that's on your desk, and he'll leave. The last character in this game is the Endo, a character that goes around your cameras shutting them down. It's your job to reset the cameras consistently, because if you don't, once he's disabled enough cameras, he'll jump scare you. While we're talking about the core aspects of this game, let's mention the art, because it's honestly really well done in this game. Yeah, I say that a lot with these games, but, you know, it's true, they all have good visual design, but this game hits especially well. Like mentioned earlier, the office is a bit empty, but the cameras are the real treat in this game. Every single one is packed with so much life, it really adds a lot of atmosphere to this game, like I mentioned earlier. While it's pretty standard to see dark rooms and cameras in FNAF games, I mean they all take place at night, I don't know what you're expecting, there's something about this game in particular that pulls this off really well. Each room is fairly dark and poorly lit, but when you see it in combination with all the characters and props and such on each camera, it's real nice. Again, it adds more and more to this atmosphere of being isolated and alone that this game has. My favorite camera in particular has to be Cam 2. Something about it just feels really special. There's props on it, sure, but the counter here is very noticeably empty, almost like this place has been barely touched or even looked at in a long time. I hope I'm not repeating myself too much here. I just really want to emphasize how well made the art and atmosphere aspects of this game are. That's art though. When it came to the actual gameplay, well, I won't lie, I was a little conflicted when I first played this game. What was apparent to me initially was, this game is a jumble of mechanics that do not blend together at all in the slightest. Something always felt off. Sure, it seems simple enough on the surface, especially with the first few nights with just Rabby and Remus showing up at your doors, but adding in the Tiny Rabbies to the mix, combined with Looney becoming way more aggressive over time, really threw off my rhythm in this game. You see, what often happens is that Rabby or Remus would show up, followed by one of the Tiny Rabbies jumping in, which would completely throw me off. Since the screen flickers when they arrive, I always took it as Rabby or Remus leaving, and by the time I realized my mistake, it was always too late. I died. Alternatively, in my attempt to quickly cycle through Rabby and Remus and go to the Tiny Rabbies, I would die to Looney because his aggression was still on. And really, because of this, I was getting really close to writing off this game as having bad mechanics. Of course, none of this was the fault of the game, I'm just bad at playing it. You see, this game is primarily based around planning ahead and making on-the-spot decisions. Because of the nature of the AI in this game, it's a little hard to predict certain things, so you really need to take things as they happened. What I eventually learned while playing this game is that the strategy aspects of this game are really good, actually. Again, I was just bad at playing it. Certain parts of the game involve more complex maneuvers and quick thinking, which are two things I like in FNAF fan games. It really adds an extra level of thought to the gameplay beyond just muscle memory. One of the most common maneuvers is the counter to the earlier scenario that I mentioned, where Tiny Rabby appears when Rabby and Remus are at your door. The simple solution to this issue is to think fast. It takes a while for the characters at the door to respond to it being shut, so in the meantime, flip down your panel, move to the desk, flip it back up, and then click the right button for the Tiny Rabby. It's a tad convoluted, but it's a good demonstration of some of the more strategic aspects of this game. Another thing that's useful on a strategic level for this game is having the knowledge you don't need to check all 3 entrances to see where the intruder at your door is. Rather, you can determine it just from checking 2. If nobody is there, you know it's automatically the other one, provided you don't hear the audio that plays when the character is behind you. This all makes for definitely the most complex gameplay you'll get out of the whole How to Survive series. Planning ahead, prioritizing, that's all a part of this game, which is definitely new for these games when you consider what the past 2 were like. Another aspect I like is how the gameplay works out with the endo. It really forces you to prioritize, because depending on how far along you were with rebooting a cam, you might have time to finish it before anyone that, say, just appeared at your door attacks you. Just remember, the longer you go without rebooting the cameras, the closer the endo gets to attacking you. For the most part, this gameplay loop is fun, especially on Night 4. Night 4 is really the peak of this game. The difficulty is just right for it to be challenging, but also fun. I definitely had the most enjoyment out of the game on that night. Each night beforehand is definitely good for getting used to the strategy and mechanics of the game, and it definitely feels like it all culminates in Night 4. Night 5, meanwhile, I get it's supposed to be the big final night of the whole series, but I do feel it really starts to cross a line between hard but fun, and hard and frustrating. There's really almost no room for error on Night 5. If you don't play perfectly, it is a guaranteed death. It really feels a little overkill on the difficulty level. If there's anything good that came out of the night being so damn hard though, it was the fact that it was really satisfying to beat, and it made the ending all the more enjoyable. I guess one other thing I could criticize this game for is the flashlight. It feels a little underused. You'll almost never run out of battery on it, or even come remotely close to it, which feels a little off to me. It's also not really used for anything other than sight. At the same time though, I don't really care. It's just a flashlight and has very little bearing over the gameplay anyway, with its usage being entirely avoidable at certain parts, so I guess it doesn't matter. Which, thinking of it now, that's probably why the battery on it never goes down much. As is standard in this series by now, after each night you are treated to a cutscene which sets up the story of the game. What's interesting though is that unlike How to Survive 2, the cutscenes and lore bits are all different from each other in terms of presentation, with Night 1 and 2 featuring more classic 8-bit style minigames, Night 3 featuring a simple note, Night 4 showing Burnt Rabby from the title screen appearing at your bed, and Night 5 finally showing the ending to this game. So let me tell you a story. You, the protagonist, are James Barn. After an increasingly unstable Rabby kills your son, out of your own anger, you kill a random kid at the Rabby's location, and dump his body in the trash cans. This game represents a retelling of your whole life. Long after the murder you caused, an old, burnt Rabby is after you, and he knows what you've done. Infected with malware from the Cypher organization, each night he gets closer and closer, until you beat Night 5, and, well...
James, come out of hiding, James. You cannot escape this. Do you even remember him? His name was Danny. He loved your restaurant. Every day, he would come to my room and tell me how excited he was to see Rabby, Remus, and Lumi perform on stage. He was a sweet boy. He loved candy. He loved his cats. He would always do the right thing. Then you shut him off to die. What this is, you have coming to you. Come out of hiding. Shh.
And that's it for How to Survive. Everything that has happened in the games ends here, with the protagonist dead and the burnt rabbit broken down on the floor as discovered by police. It's a good ending to the series. You know, the thing that strikes me as the most interesting is the way Burnt Rabbit worded things. He wants you to come out of hiding, sure, but he doesn't seem overly aggressive about it. Almost like he's leaving the choice to you, whether to keep hiding and surviving, or to exit the closet and, well, atone for your sins. And as we see from the ending, we know what decision James Barn made. Simply put, this game, it's one of the best Scratch FNAF games I have ever played. It has its flaws, namely regarding some mechanics feeling off, some balancing issues with Night 5, as well as some characters being a little poorly explained on the phone calls, but besides that, there's just very little to criticize about this game. It's a fitting conclusion all around, and really neatly ties up all the story this game has had to offer. I would say in conclusion, How to Survive is easily the best finished FNAF series on Scratch. Notice my wording there, finished. There's no other series that's been fully made that could even compare to it, in my opinion, and the impact these games have had in the community for the relatively short time it's existed for has been absolutely massive. Even as standalone projects, each of the remakes is not only fun, but smooth to play. It's hard to overstate how not only good this game series is, but just how much it's done for FNAF Scratch. And I mean, this is the series that popularized clones of all things, and games have been way better since that. These games are relatively simplistic. They always have been, even since the beginnings with the original How to Survive 1 and 2. But that's fine. This more classic style of gameplay really suits the franchise, and it set a good precedent for how fan games ought to be, and the level of quality they should strive for. It's safe to say, starting from humble beginnings all the way to now, Chuck Parker really has made a FNAF Scratch classic, and as of this year, it's finally been completed.